know that the age, a 9-year-old boy's voice is very different from a 12-year-old, is very different from a 7-year-old. In walked Spencer Fox. He was 10 years old. He was a kid that had been in for me for commercials prior to my working at Disney. He had everything. He was charismatic, he was funny, he was natural, he was smart as a whip. We all came back for the callbacks. He got the part fair and square. Because he was only 10, his voice stayed unchanged through the entire recording of The Incredibles. And at the time, the movie was in such a good script form that they were really ready to do production recording. He did all the incidentals. He did all of the toys.
No, what are incidentals?
Like, he did the video game stuff for Dash and any, I don't know if they had a campaign with McDonald's, they may have. He was able to voice all those roles because his voice remained unchanged. I had other movies where my boy's voices changed midway through, and we had a lot of challenges to either dial them up where you sound like you're on, helium. Whippets for those of us who grew up in New York City.
Yeah, I didn't want you to say peyote.
And that's a challenge in itself. So Spencer got the part, and we cut 2 years later. He came in for me for pilot season a year ago, and now he's, I think, a freshman at Sarah Lawrence College. And he's actually quoted in the book, in the animation chapter, he talks about how amazing that experience was. And if I can find the page later, I'll read it to you. So that's kids casting.
Right. Let me ask you a question here. Yeah. You're like Margaret Thatcher. I'm just waiting to get in there, right? But with regard to, and I'm really happy for Spencer, but we want to make money. Yeah. So, with regard, what would be your advice with someone that has a talented kid that's interested? Because I'm just adding that they really need to be interested in performing. What would your suggestion be on getting them into the skills of voiceover? Just from the beginning, acting classes, improv, what?
Yeah, I mean, I occasionally teach voiceover classes for kids. We're going to start to do more of them. Kids need to be really good readers because you're given that copy right there, and oftentimes they're asked to read something else. And so,
when you say copy, you mean
copy? I mean scripts. For instance, my colleague and I worked on Peter Rabbit, and for the initial, it's on Nick Jr. And for the initial audition, the boys had 13 pages of script to read and be familiar with. So an 8-year-old boy who might not be facile in reading is going to really have a challenge versus a smart 10-year-old who can process. So one of the things that at Jen Rudin Casting we espouse all the time is the importance of reading, and kids reading aloud every single night. So even though you think your child is terrific and would be a great actor, if they can't read on the spot, and be able to process a quick script that's given to you, they really can't be in show business, bottom line. And you would be shocked how many people came in for Peter Rabbit, have come in for Charmin, even a simple voiceover audition, and I can tell that they're having trouble putting the words together, and I will often call the voiceover agent because I'm a nice person and I care and say, I think you need to call this mom because he's 10 years old and he was stumbling through the reading. So he's obviously not qualified and hireable to be in this animated TV series.
Right. This is a good intro moving towards Paul. I need to move on. Hate to be a Nazi, but when she's talking about reading and a struggle with them reading, really it's a struggle with them getting the words and making them sound like it's their ideas. So it's not just reading. I mean, I shared that I had a reading disorder. That was an advantage if I had a little time to work on it because I had to take it off the page. So because no one wants a good reader, they want a good performer that makes that transition between the words to them being thoughts and feelings of their own.
Absolutely, yes.
Right.
Well,
that's what we're talking about when we talk about read. We have so many. I'm sitting here going, I know these things, but a lot. You learn all these terms and you're not sure copy, scripts, and everything. And it's good that we share this stuff. Thank you. Would you thank Jen for sharing that? Right. That's Confessions of a Casting Director, and it's here for you, free, not free. Void where prohibited by law and in the state of Wyoming. Anyway, you'll be able to meet Jen and perhaps buy her book a bit later. Is that right? You can do that? Good. Now I'm going to introduce my friend and colleague, Paul Allen Rubens, and Ruben, singular. Paul, would you share with everybody the difference between, and Paul, of course, again, audiobook narration, which is probably the most productive thing in performance in the country, certainly in my time, but the biggest fear that Audible, which is the major distributor of audiobooks, has is they're running out of narrators. Everyone has a book in them, they want to, and you just find out where the welcome mat is open. Sure, there's skills and very important, but I just want to let you know that it's amazing how many of my students that are not very skilled get a book deal. They'll call and go, I get a book deal. I go, really? What is it? Yeah, it's not War and Peace, but that you can start modestly and learn on the job. But going back to Paul, who's a wonderful teacher, what's the difference between a reader, a narrator, and a storyteller?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that question.
I have a note to ask it right here.
And I'm glad I wrote it so you could read it. Let me just, if it's okay to be a little interactive, just
Yeah, you can do what you want for 5 minutes.
How many of you, if you don't mind, I know raising your hand a little like junior high school, but how many of you are interested in audiobook narration? Think that's something you might want to do?
Raise your hand, Wendy.
Oh my God, I had no idea this many people.
Wendy Coates, raise your hand.
Very good.
We need to get you work.
All right. So, if I can, and I did bring a little bit of a crib sheet just because I wanted to make sure that I got everything in that I wanted to say in 5 minutes, and didn't walk out and think, oh. Audiobook narration. What is it? And Pat asked, what's the difference between a reader and a narrator and a storyteller? For me, audiobook narration is storytelling. And you know, often people refer to audiobook narrators as readers, which I find almost a pejorative.
That means not good.
Thank you.
He's egghead. I mean, he's unbelievable. I mean, instead of many, he says myriad. If it's confusing, he says imbroglio. I'll help you.
And Pat's doing well, too. He's a walking thesaurus himself, actually, but for a different reason. So let me try to see if I can do the following with you. And let me see if I can explain from a performance point of view what I think audiobook narration is. And apropos of what Pat has been saying every couple of seconds, which I think is appropriate, how do I get a job? How do I make money doing audiobooks? So let me predicate what I'm going to say with the following, that if you are a reader, from my perspective, important to say from my perspective, if you are a reader or even a narrator, I would argue that you're probably going to sound like everybody else, and therefore when somebody listens to your demo or you're trying to get a job and have an audition, if you regard yourself as a reader or a narrator, you're not giving yourself the best opportunity to stand out. So if you regard yourself as a storyteller, and in fact you embrace what I think are some of the skills that make you a storyteller, I think you're going to stand a much better chance of getting a job. Not always, but I think that you will. A lot of the people that I've worked with have argued the same thing. So what is a storyteller, and what do I sort of mean by that, and what is a reader? A reader would be someone, from my perspective, who uses his voice or her voice to tell a story. I've had countless people either say to me directly or certainly give the implication, I've got a great voice, I ought to be a good audiobook narrator. And in fact, I would argue the following. A great voice is nice, but in fact a great voice might be your enemy, certainly not your friend if that's what you're going to use to tell a story. Why is that? It goes right to the heart of what storytelling is all about. I would argue that storytelling, that is reading an audiobook as a storyteller, has to do with telling a story from the point of view of who or what you're talking about. And that has to do with emotion. If you use the voice to affect emotion or to indicate, how many of you like that word, indicate? That's acting student 101, right? If you use the voice to indicate, if you use the voice to modulate, to hit a word, especially while you're doing fiction, what actually happens is the following. You disconnect yourself emotionally from the listener. You do the exact opposite of what your intent is. Your intent as a storyteller is to connect yourself to the subtext which is embedded inside each word in that story. You connect yourself to that, and then you connect that subtext to the listener. So you are creating an emotional relationship.
Now, by subtext, you mean what's really going on underneath, the feelings underneath?
All right.
Generally?
Yes, let's define. You guys all know what subtext is? Should we define it, or should I give it a shot? Okay, let's define it. Let me go let me go back and ask you this question. What is it that actors can act? I'm going to argue that a storyteller is an actor. So what is it that an actor can act? One thing only, I'm going to argue. What can they act? You could tell. What?
Actions.
Emotion. Thank you. Can an actor act a word? No. If I said to you, act green. Okay. And a lot of times I'll say to an actor, so what's going on in this story? How is the character that you're talking about feeling? Well, he just walked in and it was raining outside. Okay. Act, he just walked in and it was raining outside. Okay. How did he feel about the fact that it was raining? Oh, he loves it. He loves rain. Ah, okay. Now you can act that. So what's going on is the following. In a book you have words. The words are the intellectual consequence of the story. The words are what the author gives you, and that's where all the meaning of the story is. An actor cannot act meaning. It's not possible. An actor can act emotion. An actor can act somebody's feeling about that word. So if the story is about, if the story is about a guy named Pat Fraley, who wants to be a voiceover actor but just doesn't quite have what it takes.
I'm listening.
And the more he auditions, the more people ask him to audition, not to give him the role, but just because it's kind of fun to watch him. How does Pat feel about that when he walks into the audition? That's what the actor is acting, and that's the subtext.
That's great. Now, really, it's very succinct. I got that. If I can get it, you can. So, excellent. So really, a reader is reading the words. A storyteller is really getting into the emotion. And then really, I would just add that a narrator is sort of what they use as an umbrella term for doing the performance of an audiobook.
That's right. A narrator is a fair enough
Right.
characterization, but I think what's instructive, at least for me, is the following. If you want to tell a good story, you must be a storyteller. If you are a storyteller, it means you are telling that story from the point of view of who or what you are talking about. That's the bottom line of storytelling.
Great.
That puts you in the here and now. That keeps you in the present. That keeps you from reporting.
Okay, I'm running a little short on time. That's very good right there. Would you tell them what, this is a general term, what do you think a person makes on an average book of, say, 10 hours in master length?
Right.
A couple thousand?
Well, the best way to say it is the following. Many of the audiobook companies have after contracts right now, so that's good for narrators. Don't quote me on this, but there are different pay scales and so on and so forth. But
couple grand?
somewhere around $210 a finished hour, plus pension and health. So $240 a finished hour. If you do a 10-hour book, you multiply 240 times 10 hours.
Okay, so you're looking at about a couple grand. No, I'm teasing. Okay, and it'll take you, if it's a 10-hour book, it's going to take you at least 20 hours to do the book in the studio, which is a 2-to-1 ratio. Every 1 minute page, you're going to make 2 minutes of recording because you're going to flub up. It's acceptable. Thank Paul Allen for that. Let's shift over and kind of change it up here with Phil Stockton, who is he's an editor, but he's also a lot of times is the supervising sound editor. And I want to hear from you, Phil, how you work. What's your relationship with the talent to begin with? What's your day like when you go in and do what you do?
Well, it's not just work. I don't work with actors